Get moving. Okay. Well, folks, welcome. I hope everybody is doing well, and I appreciate your participation over the last week. As I mentioned earlier, I did goof in Blackboard, and I had two separate postings for the coaching discussion, and Joe pointed that out to me, and darned if he was right. I goofed on that, and I won't do it again, hopefully. So, Joe, thanks for pointing that out. Tonight, I think we're going to have a great guest speaker. Connie Malamed is with us, and Connie, consults and writes and speaks in the field of online learning, visual communication, and information design. She is the author of the Instructional Design Guru, iPhone application, and the book Visual Language for Designers, which I think is a terrific book. And she also publishes a really great blog called The E-Learning Coach. I highly recommend that you visit that because there's a lot of good information there for people in our field, and I think it's extremely informative. Connie has degrees in instructional design and art education, and I think she's very well known in our field, and she's a local person. I believe still lives in Maryland. I'm not going to say where because I don't want to betray any privacy issues with Connie, but she is extremely generous with her time, is in great demand, and what I want to do is, Connie, turn it over to you. So what I'll do is click something on that I'll say I'm going to make you the presenter, and then you're going to click yes that you accept. Okay.
Okay, I click show my screen.
Yeah, and I can see go to webinar, download complete. Oh, okay. Looks like you're there. Okay. You have the chat function available to you as well. So if you want to use that to communicate with people, there's only 8 or 9 people in the class, so it's not like we have a cast of thousands. And I'll let you proceed however you want to with using the chat or asking questions, however you'd like to work with that.
Okay.
So it's all yours.
I'll definitely be asking questions. Hi, everyone. It's really great to meet you. I love instructional design programs, so I was happy when Greg asked me. I read a research study a few years ago that really reminded me of instructional designers and really anyone who's in the communication field. It involved, they split the participants up into 2 groups. One group were the tappers, and they had to tap out specific songs like Happy Birthday, Row, Row, Row Your Boat, pretty simple songs. And the other half of the group had to guess what the song was that was being tapped. And they said to the tappers, how frequently do you think the people will get it right? And they said, oh, probably about 50% of the time. The listeners will probably be able to figure it out 50% of the time. Well, it turned out that the listeners only understood it, guessed the correct song 2% of the time, only 2% of the time. And the reason was the tappers were singing the song in their own mind, and the listeners couldn't hear it. In a lot of ways, that's our situation as instructional designers, learning professionals, any kind of communicator. We're singing the song in our own mind, and we have a lot of difficulty, frequently, getting the message across to our audience. And definitely one of the most important ways that we can get it across is particularly in e-learning or job aids or slides, anything that has a real strong visual component is through graphics. When I went through an instructional design program, I noticed that there really wasn't much instruction on graphics, and that's one of the reasons I got into doing this so much. If you don't mind using the chat window just real quickly, just let me know who's here. You can just go by first name, what's your profession. If you're a student, that's fine. And what do you think is the hardest part of visual design? Just answer in the chat window. Being creative, great. We've got something, we're going to talk about that. 8 more people. Coming up with new letters. It's a little, I'm trying to get the window a little bit larger. Does anyone know how? So I can see more of it.
You can grab the top of it or the bottom, and then you'll see like a vertical arrow appear, and then you can just drag it.
Ah, there we go. So there are real humans here. Okay. Great. Being creative, finding the appropriate graphics, creativity, lack of art skills. I've got great news for a lot of you. Let's see. Okay, great. So generally people feel like they need a lot of art skills, and they're concerned about coming up with new ideas and being creative. Hi, Carolyn. Not using too many words is one of the problems. Yeah, that's another issue. Okay, I think today's, I pulled some lessons out of a full-day visual design workshop that I give, and I think I pulled out the right one, so I'm pretty excited about that. And it's great to meet all of you. I think I have to give it the focus again. Just wait 1 second. Okay. There we go. So this is what we're going to talk about, just getting started, some kind of little intro, the elements of visual design and practicing visual design. Some of my personal goals, I know you have your goals, these are some of mine, is to help people accept their current level of skill. If you go around feeling really bad about your artistic skills or your creative skills, you just really won't get anywhere. So you have every right to be exactly where you're at. Just accept it, and then you'll be able to move forward. It would also be great if you could see with greater awareness by the time this is over, so you can start looking at billboards and magazines, and if you take a metro, looking at the ads, just look at everything around you. Almost everything is designed in some way. And look at how people use space, and look at the typefaces they pick out, and look at the visuals and how they lay it all out. And you'll become a better designer just by seeing with greater awareness. I'm hoping that by the end of this you'll be able to design with intention and confidence. And what that means is that you'll know why you're choosing to do something. You're not just doing it haphazardly. Someone might disagree with it, but at least you know why. You have a reason. And it would also be good if you could communicate with visuals more often. Instead of using text as often, you might want to stop and think, I wonder if I could use a visual instead. And I believe it was Lynn who asked the question, does my methodology for visual design apply across the board? And it's really not my methodology as much as just pretty much an accepted methodology or accepted principles. And it does work across the board for presentation slides, for job aids, for e-learning, for training manuals. There are just some basic principles that work for anything that's visual. So one size kind of fits all in a way. Some people think that design is decoration, but it's really important. And there's this fascinating psychological phenomenon called processing fluency, and that's the ease with which a person processes information. And here's an example of it. In a cognitive psychology experiment, they gave a group of participants this exercise and said, do you think that you can do this? And notice that it was in a very readable font. And most people said, yeah, I think I could do that little exercise at my desk, no big deal. They showed another group of participants this exercise. And it was in a typeface that was very difficult to read. And most people said, I cannot do that, I don't have time, it's too difficult. This is an example of how important visual design is. The one on the left is said to have high processing fluency. It's easy for people to process. And what they deduced was if it's easy to process, then it must be easy to do. So that's just an example of how if we give learners something that's easy for them to process, they won't think that the material is as difficult and they might retain it more. Here's another example of a processing fluency experiment. They showed people this information in high contrast, meaning that it was very easy to read the text. It was much brighter than the background color. And they tried to pick cities that maybe a lot of people didn't know. And people said, they asked the people, is this information true? And when it was in high contrast, most people said, yep, that's true. Yet when they showed it to a group in low contrast, the people said it wasn't true. Most people, most participants in the study. And the reason they figure was that if people don't have anything else to go on and they don't really know the answer, then they're just going to go on the visuals, on how easy it is to process. So high contrast had high processing fluency, and essentially people thought that if it's easy to process, it must be true. So something that's well designed actually affects your credibility, or the credibility of the person who's giving the training. And isn't it cool that a lot of people said they were having trouble with creativity? I mean, I'm not happy that you're having trouble with creativity, but so many people do that this is one of the first things I like to talk about. Let's look at these two slides. In the chat window, which one of these strikes you as the most creative? So a lot of people think that the one on the bottom is the most creative. It has a picture, and we may not have thought of bullets in terms of concrete bullets that are loaded into guns. So a lot of people think that this one is more creative. So why do you think it's more creative? Can you write that in the chat window? One person said because it had a picture. It's cleaner and easier to read. It gets the point across quickly. It presents information in a unique way. And I was pretty surprised when I first saw it because I hadn't really thought of bullets like that. So to me it presented something in a new way. But you know what's interesting about it? Is this. Creativity is generating new ideas and concepts, or making connections between ideas where none previously existed. And that's what that did. That slide showed bullets in a new way. And I think if you look at the red text here, making connections between ideas where none previously existed, it really takes the pressure off because you don't have to come up with something new. You can just make a new connection or see something in a new way, and that's creativity. So don't be hard on yourself. You're probably doing creative things every day. But psychologists think of creativity as any kind of new idea, action, or the production of an object that's valued by people. And that depends on the culture and society that you're in. And there's two kinds of thinking. There's divergent thinking, which is, oops, I don't want that yet. Divergent thinking is like when you're just going down the road with your foot on the gas pedal. I was driving through Texas like that once and got a ticket. Anyway, it's like just driving through and ideas are coming, and that's your divergent thinking. And then at some point you have to stop and get into convergent thinking and start analyzing your ideas and seeing which ones are doable. So you really need both halves when you're doing something creative. Divergent thinking for picking up ideas and convergent thinking later on for judging which ideas are feasible. But don't mix the two. Go with the divergent thinking first. So let's try a little exercise here. Why don't you just in the chat window quickly think up a graphic that would represent success. It can be anything in the world. What kind of photo or graphic would represent success if you were trying to express that visually? Can you write that in the chat window? Thumbs up, crossing the finish line trophy, money. A runner goes through the finish line tape, jumping for joy. A ribbon. That's great. Thumbs up. Well, the reason I have you do this exercise is just to prove to yourself that you are creative. Look at how quickly people came up with ideas. And you know, sometimes when you can't come up with an idea, particularly if you're working with other people, you can just ask them for ideas, or you can go to Google Images and type in a word, and you'll see all kinds of graphics that might give you ideas. Because sometimes we need help. You know, one thing people might not realize about instructional design is that a lot of times you have to be creative on demand, and that's not always the easiest thing to do every day. So in this book, Conceptual Blockbusting by James Adams, he has mentions four things that stop creativity, and you can see if any of these are part of what might be stopping you. One is perceptual and mental blocks. You perceive what you expect, and I thought that the old Apple and PC commercials were great for that because they stereotyped which type of people use PCs and which type of people use Macs, and then they kind of brainwash you with that, and you become to expect that from people. So it's important to try to break through, you know, perceive within yourself. Are you having some perceptual mental blocks? Because you'll always perceive what you expect. Another thing is whether you have emotional blocks. For example, you might be at a brainstorming meeting, and you might be scared to bring up your ideas. So you have to really watch for that. That can often stop people's creativity because they're scared to fail. Because in school there was only one right answer, but when you're being creative, there are many, many, many answers. The third is cultural blocks. Our society says play is a waste of time, humor has no place in problem solving, and intuition and emotion are inferior to logic and reason. And as you can imagine, I'm sure you know that none of those are true, but you have to watch for the cultural blocks that people have. And also there are environmental blocks. A lot of times if you're in a work situation, it's noisy, your environment is just not conducive to creativity, and so you might want to go out and take a walk or start doodling or put on earphones to block out the noise. So here are some ways to enhance creativity. One is to make associations, which is a synthesis of unusual objects or ideas. Another is to create metaphors. In this poster about how dangerous unwashed food can be, the mushroom became a mushroom cloud from like a nuclear weapon. This is a great metaphor from a presentation on the dangers of smoking, a corpse and a cigarette. You can make word maps. For example, let's say you were making a course on email etiquette. You can just come up with ideas yourself and see if any of those work. Sketching is a really important way to get creative, even if you only draw stick figures, because sketching is a different mindset, and it opens up an entire channel in your brain of a new way of looking at things. Sometimes for me, I just pick up, I'm not an amazing illustrator, but as soon as I pick up a pencil, my mind opens up to new ideas and open up my sketchbook. Kind of a habit. You can collect. I go around, and when I see cool looking typefaces or nice backgrounds and textures, I just paste them into a little book. And then when I need inspiration, I have it. I can look through. Doodling is always great for coming up with ideas. You can look for patterns in nature and try to replicate those. I love this approach. Has anyone here used this? Write ideas on sticky notes. If you're trying to organize something and then move them around on the wall. Beth says she has. Jessica uses it for storyboarding. That's another good idea. Now here's the part, it was like I read your minds. People were saying that they didn't have artistic skills. Well, I have great news for you. It's a lot easier to get good at visual design than it is to get good at art. Take it from me, I'm a failed artist. A lot of people don't realize it, but design is really problem solving. It's visual problem solving. And art is an end in itself. So these are some of the differences between the two, although some of the principles do overlap. Design always communicates a message, and if it doesn't communicate the intended message, then it is not effective. But art is for self-expression. Design usually starts with assets. You usually have perhaps a client's logo, some photos that they want to use, perhaps they have a palette that they want you to use. And art starts with a blank slate, like a blank canvas or a lump of clay. That's much harder. Design is judged by effectiveness, and art is judged by its beauty or insight. So I hope you see that it's a lot easier to become a designer or to get better at design, because what you're really doing is solving a visual problem. And I think that this definition of graphic design, there are many, many definitions, but this one makes it all seem so simple. What it is the organization of visuals and type, or text, in space. That's all the graphic design is. Visuals, the organization and arrangement of visuals and type in space. And we're going to look at each of these three elements. Does anybody have anything they want to comment before we go on? Okay. So let's look at organizing space. This makes it seem less intimidating. Excellent. That's my goal. This author and design educator says the single most overlooked element in visual design is emptiness. You know, a lot of us really don't think about space as an element, but it's actually essentially almost like an object. So to see space, you have to practice seeing its shape. Instead of looking at the foreground here, look at the background, and it has a shape. And space and form need each other. Without one, you really don't have the other. And text also breaks up space. Look at the space between the letters. And space has certain qualities that you can become more aware of. First of all, there's the frame. It gives it context. There's also the shape or the orientation. This is more the shape. This type of horizontal rectangle is more the shape of a slide or an e-learning course. A vertical orientation is more the shape of a document, training manual, job aid, maybe even a mobile app. And when you put a border on something, when you put a border on something, that also changes how we see the space. There's a certain tension that occurs when you move a shape closer to the edge. There's a little bit of a pull. You see, they talk about that a lot in art. It's also true in visual design. Also think about the margins. Here's one way to see this picture, or to place this picture. And you can have it as a bleed where it goes right up to the edges, and that makes space different because there's no extra space here. So how many people are familiar with the term negative or white space? It seems to be that a lot of people have heard of that now. It used to be very esoteric. So negative and white space are used pretty synonymously. There's positive space where the form is. Oh good, finally one person doesn't know. At least I can be useful. So the form is positive space, and negative space is the area not occupied by visuals or text, and that's your white space. And you can use, as you become more aware of white space, you can use it to convey meaning. For example, here are two people arguing, and when they get closer, you can use it really to express emotion. It looks like the argument is even more intense this way. You can use white space to tell a story. If you were creating an e-learning course and you needed to tell a story, one thing that's really important to remember is that the learners and humans in general must have meaning. So they will create meaning, and if you tell them what something means, they will believe it. So if you want to tell a story about a boss who quit, there you go. That would be the missing share. If you want to tell a story about someone being late, you can use white space to do that. You can, whatever story you want, people will relate it to the picture, and you can use white space for that. You'll find that in advertisements, when you start looking at them more, you'll find that they use white space to express sophistication. Whenever you see those home magazines with those very sophisticated and clean rooms that we all hate, there are very little furniture in there. And of course, white space does not have to be white. It just means that it's emptiness. And here's that same advertisement all filled up without the white space. And you can see how in one way it just looks a little more sophisticated. Isolation will do that. You can use white space to enhance learning, leaving a lot of space around elements that you want to show. You can use white space for information access and information design. This is how to identify a transmission. It's very clean and easy to read because of the white space. Another aspect of space is whether it's static or dynamic. So in static space, you'll find proportional areas of white space. So the white space on the upper left is pretty much equal to the white space on the bottom right. And when it's static, it's a little bit more peaceful. A lot of times it's not quite as visually interesting, but there are times for everything. For example, someone teaches yoga. Well, you might want to use a very static pose and someone centered and something very symmetrical. In this case, we're talking about death. I would say that that's pretty static. So this was a good case, a good time to use a static approach. A more dynamic approach is something that's asymmetrical. It's a little bit more interesting. There's more tension. It catches your eye. I like this one from Steven Anderson. I just thought that if you're asking why, there's a certain amount of emotional intensity. And it was good to have it asymmetrical here. So those are the kinds of things you can begin to think about when you're designing something. One thing that professional designers use a lot of is grids. And it can help you with layout. Now here's a very simple grid. You can overlay this on PowerPoint. PowerPoint comes with these dotted grids. I don't like it as much as this 9-space grid. It just fits well in PowerPoint, I think. You can make it in a graphic program and bring it in as a graphic, or you can just make it out of the shapes in PowerPoint if you're working in PowerPoint. And one way that you can use a grid is to fill up areas while you're playing around with ideas. Let's say you want an image on the left and some larger text on the right. Then you know you're going to have an explanation and a reference. And you can play around with just these shapes, filling in the squares, and see where you might like to lay things out. And then when you have something that you're happy with, that feels balanced, you can add it in and remove the grid and see if you like it. And after a while, you might get pretty good at doing that, of laying out with a grid. Now, if you're making templates for slides or for e-learning, you don't have to do this for hundreds of screens. You might make 6 templates like this and reuse it on a regular basis. But if you reuse it too much, then of course people start to get bored because they know what's coming. So then you might want to break the grid and just do something completely different to grab their attention for something really important. It's always a fine line between making things seem unified but not making them seem boring. And then there is this theory of visual design called the rule of thirds, and I'm guessing anyone who's into photography has heard of this. Is that correct? So in the rule of thirds, again, you're dividing things up into thirds, and there are 2 theories about this. One is simply that when your main feature, what you want to have the focus, is in one of the thirds, it's just more aesthetically pleasing and interesting to people. Also, where the lines intersect are called power points, and if you put your main feature there, that is also, can also be a point of interest. So I took this computer graphic repair course. Let's say this was a title screen, and I moved it to put the person's eye right in the PowerPoint, because our eyes will follow the gaze of someone. So this is one way to do it, and also the computer's important, so that's in the other third. So our eyes will immediately go down to the hands, and I think that's a bit more interesting. I wanted to show you this because this is a great example of someone was saying, can you look at thirds horizontally or vertically? I believe that you can. That's how I do it. I look at it horizontally or vertically. However, there's also the issue of when some people put more value on things that are at the top of the screen, it has more visual weight. So if you want people to really notice something, you're probably not going to put it at the bottom. Whatever you want them to look at first should go closer to the top or to the upper left. That's just a general rule. You can break every single rule here. Just know why you're breaking it. Here's an example of an extreme grid layout. And we've had a lot of interesting discussions about this, and I know we don't have time for a lot of discussions, but it's about why Latinos will pick the next president. What do you think of the use of the grid here? Just analyze it for a minute. All right, an answer in chat. How does this cover design strike you? What did you feel from it when you first looked at it? What do you think about it as you continue to look at it? Why do you think the designer did it this way? Okay, this is a great analysis, people. At first, someone mentioned that it was overwhelming, and at first, it is a little overwhelming for a lot of people. But it does show the diversity of Latinos so that you can't really stereotype. And someone was saying maybe that's why they made it so busy. It's also interesting that that the words catch your attention first, or at least for a lot of people it did, and then you slowly begin to look at all the different faces. Great analysis, and I guess you can all see each other's answers, so very good. Interesting. Let's talk about alignment. You'll notice in this grid, use of a grid, that everything is pretty neatly aligned, and that's one of the hallmarks of professional designs. It's going back through your work and making sure that things are aligned. And you really have three chances. There's three types. There's the edge alignment, making sure that everything is aligned on one edge. Center alignment, making sure that everything is aligned in a center axis. And if it's overlapping, I guess you're a little bit off the, it's not as hard, is it? And you'll see this overlapping a lot, and when it makes sense, you'll see photo, whenever people are expressing photos. By the way, someone said they didn't see the Time magazine, and it does get lost in that title. And I wanted to show you how professional, I love to look at magazine covers. When you're standing in supermarket lines, look at how they're designed. See if you can catch the alignment. Pretty amazing, huh? So professional designers spend a lot of time making sure everything is aligned, and that's one of the things that can give your work a professional flair. Someone asked, where are the PowerPoints? I don't think they used that approach for this. I think that the burger being the largest item was what they wanted to be in the focus. Notice, though, that it's not directly in the center. It is somewhat asymmetrical. Just like I was saying, there are no rules that you have to stick to. Just know what you want to do, what the main point is, what your main focus is, and then go for that. As long as you have a reason and make it intentional, I'm giving you some guidelines, but people break them when they need to. So let's look at some issues with negative space. One problem is having trapped space. So it's better to work from the center out than from the outside in. If you put things around the edges, you can come up with awkward trapped space. It just isn't that aesthetically pleasing. That would be a solution. Just take away some of the graphics. Another issue is just placing things so you have a lot of little rivers and gullies of white space. And one solution I came up with was to put it all on a grid. And since I didn't have enough graphics, to just repeat them in color and black and white. Maybe I copied it from that Time magazine. I'm not sure which came first. So in summary, think of white space as a design element similar to text and pictures. Let's talk a little bit about, well, maybe we should just see if anyone has anything they want to say about, or questions they want to ask about white space or space, layout, grids. Anyone want to say anything or have any questions? Okay, so remember the three elements of graphic design are space.
I have a question.
Okay, go ahead.
I've always been told that a person's eye pulls more to the right side, and it's kind of best that you put your main point or your main focal point to the right. Is that true?
Well, that's interesting. I haven't heard that before. I think that most research shows that a page or a computer screen, that the eye falls in the upper left. And that's why almost on all the websites, or most websites, you'll see the logo in the upper left. And then there are a couple patterns that are fairly common. One is the Z pattern, where you go from left to right, diagonally across, making it a Z on the screen or page. And the other is an F pattern where you start in the upper left and go across, kind of drawing out an F shape, like the letter F. Now, people are also drawn to very large things, things of high contrast, like a bright color that contrasts, and also positioning at the top. So there are ways to get people to draw the eye, and also to faces. People are very drawn to faces. But, you know, there's usually controversy about everything, but I haven't heard the right-left controversy too much. I think it's fairly well accepted that upper left is where the eye lands on the screen or page. Now, maybe they were thinking of something else, some other format or medium.
I could have it backwards. I could have it backwards. Yeah.
Anyway, I'm glad you asked the question.
I do recall talking about the Z formation.
Hmm.
But then that would have to indicate that you start on the left if it's a Z.
Yeah.
So I could definitely have it backwards. My apology.
No problem. You know what's kind of cool? There's a lot of research. I mean, it's not definite, but a good amount of research that shows that people go from left to right, even in languages that are right to left. So that's kind of interesting. That's not a definite, but like even in Hebrew, even someone who reads Hebrew would still look at the upper left and go to the right. But that is a little bit hard to believe. Anyway, so Lynn is saying, for the Z pattern, are you saying you would put text across the top, then what would the diagonal be? Well, you wouldn't put text on a diagonal, but the diagonal would be that the eye would be traveling in a diagonal from the upper right to the lower left. I mean, there's so many things that get in the way, like something large or a face or contrast or any kind of emphasis, that you can probably control the eye by putting something, you know, at the top or in the upper left and then making it large. I mean, that is one of the big things that we want to do, is control the eyes of our users, of our viewers. With a graphic, yes, with a graphic with shape, with large text, anything like that. Great questions, really. So let's go on to typography. So if just so that you can answer this question, if you're ever, you know, on a quiz show, a typeface, even though most people use the terms synonymously now, and I fall into that too these days, a typeface is really different than a font. A typeface is the large umbrella of all the letters, punctuation, numbers that have a particular design. So if Arial is the typeface, then Arial 24-point bold is the font. And this comes from the days of printing presses before everyone could become a designer with computers. So the typeface for Garamond, an example of a font would be Garamond 28-point Roman. So a specific style, Roman means the letters up and down, just straight, like regular. And a specific point size, that's the font. And you know, you could just act uppity sometime when you're speaking to a graphic designer. Corbel 24-point italic, that's the font, and the other is the typeface. I just wanted you to know that, because as you continue in this field, you'll hear people say typeface, people say font, and you'll just know what they mean, or at least they're just using it synonymously. Well, there's some really interesting research that typefaces have personality. By the way, I'm sorry, I don't know if this red is really bright to you, but it is for me. These are slides that were used in a large presentation room, so it wasn't as intense. But anyway, they showed people, participants in the study, 15, I believe it was 15 different typefaces, and the interesting thing is none of these people were visual designers. And the participants consistently described 15 typeface forms as having unique personality attributes. So people, your audience members, your viewers, your learners really do notice on an unconscious level whether you've chosen the right typeface. And a lot, you know what I use a lot? It's just super neutral, and that's what I'm using in this presentation, I believe. It's called Myriad Pro, MYRIAD Pro. It's just very simple, and I'm pretty sure it comes on PCs and Macs. Someone says, Lynn says she really likes Myriad Pro. Yeah, it's just so nice. And Verdana, as you know, probably know, was also made for the computer screen. That was the first typeface created just for the computer screen. But anyway, let's move on. Here's a little quiz for everyone. I just want to show you how you can tell what typeface, what personality a typeface has too. So which one of these four do you think is casual and friendly? 1, 2, 3, or 4. Just type it in the chat window. Yep, got it right. Which one do you think is direct and straightforward? If you don't agree, it's okay. There we go. Most people found that one too. Which one do you think is elegant and sophisticated? I think that one's kind of obvious. One. That's your wedding invitation typeface. And which one is reserved and conservative? Yep. So there's proof that 5. So that's proof that typefaces have personality. So just to become more aware of different typefaces, I just want to show you, there are so many, the anatomy of a typeface, and there are so many little parts to those people who create typefaces or those people who study them. I've read a book once by someone who had a master's degree in typography. I'm just going to show you a few parts of a typeface so that you can begin to become more aware of them. The bottom area, the bottom line, is called the baseline. So over here in this typeface, notice that in this word, the P comes and the S come down a little bit below the baseline. The middle line is the mean line, and the X height is often used as a measurement. It's the size of X and where it lands on the mean line. The cap height goes above the mean line to the top line. The serif is that little ornamental line or slab added to the letters. The descender is what comes down below the baseline. The ascender comes above the mean line. And the counter, notice the shape of the counter. That's the ball in P and those letters with rounded designs such as B. So it's just really interesting. There are many, many, many more aspects of the anatomy of a typeface, but I just wanted you to look at these and then look at these 3. Now maybe you'll look at them a little bit differently. Look at the counter of the middle A, of the word in the middle. Look at the X height. Look at how that varies. Look at the serifs and the ones without the serif. Look at how the A's are completely different. Look how far down the Y goes, the descender goes. That'll just help you become more aware of typefaces. And there are many, many different categories, but I feel like for your everyday instructional designer, including myself, I just go with the serif, sans serif, and script, which looks like handwriting. If we just stick to those and think of those and become aware of those, we're ahead of the game. And there are all kinds of arguments about which is best, serif or sans serif. And the research is conflicting. Certainly people think that serif fonts are good for reading print because they say that the little lines, the serifs, move the eye along. And there tends to be a consensus that on the web that a sans serif is easier to read, but you'll find arguments on both sides. You just have to try it out yourself. So when you're selecting a typeface, you have to think about the type of content, the affective state or feeling, or the personality that the typeface projects, the audience characteristics, and the medium and the use. You might pick something different for print than you would for slides. So this is from a slide of course I gave for the Immigration Service in D.C. Display type is what they call the large typeface, the large fonts that are in that you use for titles. Then there's body text. There are labels on graphics, and there are captions on graphics. And you have to think about all of these. For example, you might be able to get a little bit crazy with your display type if the content and audience lend themselves to that, because even if it's a little bit hard to read in some situations, it might be okay. But your body text is always going to need to be very clean and crisp and easy to read. So if you're choosing one typeface for an entire course, you can select a family with many styles. For example, Gilson, look at all the styles it has: Roman, bold, and italic. A lot of the free or cheap fonts that you get will only have Roman. And look at Franklin Gothic. It's got book, medium, heavy, and condensed. So you can do fine, and I often do this. I just use one typeface for an entire course. Now if I'm showing somebody writing on a bulletin board, or writing on a whiteboard, maybe I'll put in a handwriting font. Or you combine two categories, but only two. So this will help you not drive your audience crazy. And if you use two typefaces, try to find two from different categories, for example, serif and sans serif. And then try to find ones that have something in common or go well together. For example, now that you know about looking at the shape, perhaps you would pick two typefaces that both have very round letters, or that both have very thin letters. But yet people can really tell them apart because they're serif or sans serif, or they're script and serif. Does that make sense? Those are great guidelines to just use one or two typefaces. It's amazing how far you can get. And as far as typography goes, it's really important to think in terms of legibility and readability. Legibility refers to perception. They're not synonyms. And it's actually, can you decipher it? Can you literally perceive it? And readability is, can you comprehend it? Can you form words out of it? That's why Ellen Lupton, who works in Baltimore at MICA, and she's a great, well-known design writer, says that design is as much an act of spacing as an act of marking. You can affect readability through font size by making it larger, kerning, leading, line length, and contrast. I'm going to show you examples of each of these. Kerning is adjusting the spacing between two characters so they are placed in correct relationship. And in many of our tools, we don't have the option for adjusting the kerning, but if I'm making a title slide in a graphic program, I will really concentrate on the kerning. Leading is the line spacing, or the vertical space between lines of text. And it comes from, in the old print days, these are actually pieces of lead that were placed in between the letters when they set type. That's where leading comes from. The vertical space between lines of text, you have to make sure there's really enough there. Also, in terms of columns, if you're making a manual, people have an easier time, or at least a preference, for reading shorter lines. They say something like between 50 to 70 characters in line length. So columns are often better. You don't want to make a slide or an e-learning, put this on a slide or an e-learning course. That's too much text. And readability also requires sufficient contrast. So this is a gradient fill. It goes from dark at the top to light at the bottom, and it's a big gradient fill. There's a big range there of colors. Sometimes it can be a little bit hard to read or to find text that can go over it, because it's hard to find something that works on dark and on light. So when you have a narrower gradient, the colors are closer together, it makes it easier to find a color that can give you sufficient contrast. And you can also have trouble with busy backgrounds. I'm sure you've seen this, or perhaps you've done this yourself. I probably did it before I learned much about visual design, which is that you put text over something busy and it's hard to read, so you can just put a solid box of color or any shape of color behind it, and that looks okay, but if you make it a little bit transparent, it makes it more unified, because then you can see what's behind it. Just makes for a little bit more unified design. That's only maybe 10% transparent. Thanks, Beth. And finally, emphasis. There's a really good visual design book that I recommend. It's by Robin Williams, and it is called Design for Non-Designers, Graphic Design for Non-Designers. Robin Williams is the author. And she brings up the point that the underline is old school because it came from typewriter days. That's really amazing. There was no other way to emphasize. And the reason I don't like to use underlines is because I do a lot of e-learning and people are always clicking on them because they think that they're links. So nowadays, really, the underline is just, there are a couple reasons to not use it. So you can use italics for emphasis. You can use color or size for emphasis. Oh, and that's the end of the typography one. Let me see how we're doing on time here. I think we're doing okay. Anybody have any comments or things they wanted to say about typography or typefaces or fonts? Okay. I like it when no one asks me hard questions, so let's go on. Let's talk about visuals. Oh, my faves besides Myriad Pro. Well, you know what's kind of interesting? I've seen surveys where they ask professional designers who, you know, work 60 hours a week only doing design, which typefaces they like. And most of them like the ones that have been around for like 100 years. Or maybe 50 years. Very old, solid typefaces that have just been transferred to the computer. So my favorites, let's see, I like Garamond when you're looking for a serif font. I use Myriad Pro a lot, and Verdana for the computer screen. I like Franklin Gothic, some of the ones I've showed. And how about you? Which typefaces do you like? Anybody have any favorites? Tahoma? Verdana, I'm not familiar with that one. Helvetica, yep, that's an old standby. Arial, Palatino. Yeah, those are all good. I mean, it really just depends on your audience, the considerations. Minion Pro, I've used that, but I kind of can't remember what it looks like. I really like the script ones when you're showing something on, you know, the ones that look like handwriting when someone is, you know, it's supposed to look as though someone's writing on a paper or a board. I know they're harder to read. I don't know why I like them. Oh, Verdana or Dana. Which one was I talking about? Oh yeah, I said Verdana. Thanks, Lynn. Palatino, someone else said they like that one too. All right, let's go into visuals. So remember now, we've got visuals, we've got type, and we're arranging them in space. I go with space first because that's kind of like the backdrop for everything else. Visual language is a system of communication that uses graphical elements and has its own grammar and syntax. So I wish they taught this in school, you know, starting in first grade. Because just like we teach written and verbal language, visual language has its own grammar. And the grammar Part of the grammar is made up of shapes, images, icons. Let's look at shapes. We've got our geometric shapes, and notice that each one of these kind of gives you a different feeling, a different sensation. Perception is like that. And we've got different kinds of lines and organic shapes. And these are some of the components of visual language. There's also texture and color. When you see something that's horizontal, it's somewhat peaceful, and of course, horizontal comes from the horizon. So when you want to give a sense of stability, a sense of peacefulness, use horizontal shapes or horizontal images. And look at how different this makes you feel. The vertical, it's thrusting up. It's dynamic. If you want to give a sense of something dynamic, something active, use vertical shapes. And even more dynamic are diagonals. This causes a certain kind of tension. That was like the layout, and here are some designers to read about. It causes a certain amount of tension. It throws you off balance. It's interesting. But if you're talking about something very peaceful, you might not want to use that approach. Which type of image should you use? A lot of people, I have an article about this on my website. I think it's called What Graphics Should I Use? And I just want to show you some ideas of images. So when you need something concrete, you can easily use an iconic form, and that works just as well, and in some cases it's easier to perceive. Especially if you're talking about something complex, novices might have an easier time when you reduce the realism and make something iconic. So you can use a very realistic image and all the way down to iconic, or very, very simple and almost abstract. If you're telling a story or painting a scenario, I often try, if I really have to paint a scenario, well, I either use some of the images from some of the cutout people from eLearning Art or the eLearning Brothers, but best of all, I like to just do an inexpensive photo shoot and have somebody act it out. So if you're telling a story or painting a scenario, try to use storytelling types of photos. When you're explaining something unfamiliar, use a visual metaphor. For example, a database is like a filing system. When you need to categorize information, this is another good use of icons. I'm guessing some of you probably do this if you're already working in the field. You might put a little icon in the topic you're in, and it will help people. Works as a mnemonic device and helps people understand where they are, and it orients them. When you're explaining parts and components, use pretty much an illustrated diagram with callouts. When you need to explain motion, this is the path of Hurricane Katrina, I believe. This is an interesting way to show motion. So don't think that you can't explain motion with a visual. You can. If it's related to location, you can use a map. These are ways to get away from using so many words. When you're explaining a system or an entity, you can, again, use a system diagram. And one little tip here, you could do this all with boxes, but one little tip is that when you use simple little clip art type drawings, clip art I guess has a bad name, but they really work, a bad reputation, but they work well in diagrams. People find them, that it makes it a lot more clear. Of course you need labels too, but this is a diagram of how VoIP service works. Just think of how much more interesting it is because we have little iconic images. With a process, you're pretty much using a diagram, but you're going to use arrows because one thing comes before the next. This is how water is treated. It's explaining the process. And those arrows moving the process along really work. We know how to read them because we're living in a visually literate society. We've learned it. Here's a great example of how something works. Label it and do a call out. Maybe you would have a little explanation too, or in audio, or in text. When you're making comparisons, you use graphs. These are the average times of when people travel in rush hour. I thought this was really interesting for comparisons. It really shows a photograph of the components, and you can compare the size with the ruler at the top. I thought this was kind of brilliant. I don't see this kind of graphic very often. And one of the reasons I like to show so many graphics is to give you ideas. Matt, what were you talking about? Helps to keep it visually simple. Sorry, I missed that. You mean, is it this graphic that you were referring to? Oh, using the clip art diagram. Yeah, right. If you put a photograph there, it would have too many visual cues. Yes, I can see some places to get good icons and graphics. We do need to talk about that, don't we? Iconfinder.com is one place where you can find icons. They just started selling some, but there are a lot of freebies there. On my website, if you go to the elearningcoach.com and go to freebies, I have a list of places where you can get stock photos, but there's ThinkStock, there's iStock, but that's gotten kind of expensive lately. Well, you know, to someone who says your employers hate clip art, when it's in a diagram, it's not really clip art. You know, call it iconic art. We're not talking about those silly cartoon characters. Call it iconic graphics. See if that works. My mind is kind of going blank for other places to find icons other than in the stock photo sites you can find them. I just do a search for something like medical icons. But there are a lot of free places. So go to my site, the elearningcoach.com, look under freebies. Sometimes I call it resources, and there's a menu there, and there's a list of places where you can get them. Or just do a Google search for free icons. You like that, Sarah? Okay, if you're representing quantitative information, it's so much better to do something like this, and everyone can do this, can make 10 circles and repeat them for percentages. And if you're talking about boys and girls, make sure you make everything for the men blue and everything for the women pink. Just joking. I have a bias against that. Here's an interesting way to represent quantitative information in a pictogram. Just find a little symbol, a little icon, it's not clip art, and repeat it for the number of times. Pictographs are great, and they're interesting. And you know, the thing is, they show the exact amount in numbers too, so people don't have to sit there and count. Okay, if your audience needs specific values, put it into a table, because you can scan down a table quickly. And I thought this was a kind of a cool example. Instead of just making a list, I kind of turned it into a little bit of a survey. I thought that was kind of a cool idea. And that is it for visuals. What do you have to say, folks? Anything you want to say about this? Great ideas. Okay, great. That's what I'm here for, inspiration. Really simple stuff. Yes, you can do it. Just buy the stock, buy little icons or get them for free and repeat them. Okay, great. Good ideas for Greg, too. I'm so happy. I know we all learn from each other. I was just thinking when I saw the name of your course, I was thinking, gosh, it would be fun to sit in. I'm sure I would learn a lot, too. We need to send instructional designers back to school for a course or two. Well, let's get into practicing visual design because there were a lot of questions about storyboarding in the questions that you asked me. Oh, and also people asked a question about copyrights. How do you deal with them? When you buy from a stock photo site, they're usually royalty-free, meaning you can use them in e-learning courses, you can use them in job aids. You probably can't use them, and you have to go to the license. You probably can't use them when if you're selling something, like if you took the graphic and put it in a book, you wouldn't be able to do that. But for e-learning courses and things that are being distributed internally, you can certainly use it. And if you have questions, you can always ask the company where you buy the stock photo. Lynn had mentioned often it's difficult to find the copyright. Well, if it's difficult to find the copyright, then there's a good chance it's not copyright free. That usually happens when you're just trying to take something off of a site on the internet, and usually you're not allowed to do that. A lot of times if you go to a .gov site, especially if it's the U.S. government, not a small town government, many times you can use those, and there's almost always a copyright policy there. What if you're taking an e-learning course through a college? People are paying to take the course. Yeah, I would think that if it's internal and for educational uses, you would probably be able to use it like I just did tonight. One of the big things is that they don't want you distributing them or selling the graphics themselves, but I am not a lawyer, so you'd have to check. So don't take my advice. Check it out with the people first. I'm just saying what I think. A lot of people had personal questions or questions that didn't relate to visual design, so I thought I'd just try to stick to the visual design questions. Someone asked, are there ISD jobs for visual design specialists? And I have worked in companies that had very large teams, which I know is more rare, and then they did have graphic designers or visual design specialists. So I think it is possible to get a job doing that. Joe asked that question. Someone asked, when you refer to visual design for learning, do you mean Gagne's 9 events? And I didn't really, when I think of visual design for learning, I just mean using visual design for any kind of instructional product where people are being asked to retain information, to process, to perceive and process and then retain the information. That's the way I think of it. That's my own definition. So let's talk a little bit about storyboarding because people had so many questions. In that freebies or resources part of my website, it's the menu bar that's at the top. I have something called Storyboard Depot, and a lot of people contributed storyboards there that you can download for free, and this has been going on for about 3 years. And I have a storyboard that I have up there, and to tell you the truth, I never do it in Word anymore. I always do it in PowerPoint if I have to storyboard. But this is an example of a Word one, and I just made this up. You just basically think about the type of information that you're going to need to communicate to someone, to a client, to a designer. And then you make a rectangle for that information or some kind of box. And someone asked, do you have to storyboard? And you don't. A lot of times people just go directly into PowerPoint if they're using that for e-learning, or directly into Storyline or Captivate and put a general idea of what they want there. So you can avoid the process. But something like this can work. So let's say we've got our visual description or sketch there. Someone asked, do you sketch? Well, if you sketch it, say you put stick figures in where you want things, then you have to scan it unless you're drawing it directly into the program. Sometimes I'll just go to a clip art site and put in a bad graphic there, not one that I really want, but just like a person. And you can also just do it all in text. Then you've got your narration or your script, your interactions and miscellaneous notes, because maybe the programmer will come back. Let's say you're working on a team. Perhaps the programmer will come back and write, I can't do that. The software won't do that. Can you come up with another kind of interaction? So here's an example. I have this on my website. I used to have 3 cats, and giving them medicine just drove me crazy. So this is pretending that it's a course on how to give a cat medicine, because I would just end up like scratched all over the place. So this is an example. The visual would be over here. How do you feel about giving your cat medicine? There would be the narration and my little notes of how I would wanted the female narrator to project their voice, and interactions in the bottom left. This is an example of one type of storyboarding. There are about as many types of storyboards as there are people. But these are the 2 examples that I wanted to show you. You can do it in PowerPoint. You can do it in any tool you want. There are specific tools for storyboarding. Just look it up. Why don't you ask some questions, because I know this is a big issue for people. This is one of the most important things I wanted to cover. Do you want to ask questions either in chat or through audio?
Whatever you prefer is fine, Connie. Doesn't matter.
Okay, either way. Okay, so Jessica has a good point. I struggle with when to bring in visual design versus content. And when you say content, do you mean the text on the screen or the script, Jessica? Is that what you mean when you say content? Yes, text and what the narrator says. Well, I would like to hear from other people who storyboard. I kind of do it both ways. I know I have to wrap my arms around the content first, or nothing's going to make sense. Sometimes I'll use a 2-column script where I start scripting and then I'll go into the visuals. Sometimes I'll have a great visual idea, so as I'm analyzing the content, I'll note that. Some people start in Keynote as soon as possible. Okay. Joseph does it that way. Lately, I've been doing it a completely different way for the past few years, and that is I'll look over and do a content analysis, and I'll forget about the storyboarding at first. I'll think, what do people need to do, because that's the most important thing, because I'm trying to streamline the e-learning. What do people need to do? And I'll try to come up with an interaction first, so I'll base everything around the interaction. And once I have the interaction figured out, then I just only give, and the interaction is what people need to do, because this is what they're going to be doing on the job. Then I only bring in the information that supports that interaction. So you might like that approach, Jessica, starting with an interaction first and then seeing what supports that. Alice starts with visuals because she's very visual and then goes into the script. So Beth likes the idea of going onto an interaction first, and maybe I should write an article about that, but that's really the only way I know to streamline things, because the subject matter experts will give me so much information that it's overwhelming. So now I'm just narrowing things down to what do people need to do. And that's a little bit hard. I do a lot of medical training because in a lot of cases it's what do people need to know when they're treating a patient. But I try to put it in a realistic context or a scenario and make it interactive first and then put everything around it. Jessica's saying, please write an article about it. Isn't that using the subtractive approach? That's interesting. It's a minimalist approach. Maybe it is subtractive. I'm not sure. I'll have to think about that one, Lynn. Well, I hope this helped you some. Please go and download all the storyboards you can find. People have donated ones in PowerPoint, and if you have any that you'd like to donate, just let me know, and I'll put them up there. That's one thing I love about training people and instructional designers. We're really happy to share with each other. It's a great community of people. So the other thing I wanted to talk about, if we have a little bit of time, is your toolbox. If you want to be a visual designer, you have to have a sketch pad, and if you only sketch in stick figures and geometric shapes, that's perfectly fine. Perfectly fine. That's all you need to do. You don't need to be an illustrator. That's a whole other career. But it will help you. It will help you come up with ideas. And you know, I make the same mistake that a lot of people do, which is sometimes I'm in a big rush and I'll just dive right into it. And it always takes more time. You have to design first before you dive into the course. The other thing you're going to need is a graphic program with layers, and this is an example of Photoshop, but there are other graphic programs that use the layer paradigm, and in the layer paradigm, whatever is at the top overlays what is at the bottom. So a model is what I'm showing on the left. Each one of those circles is on a layer, and your finished graphic is going to look like this. If that explains it, that's the best I could do to try to explain what the layer paradigm is. But it allows you to overlap things easily. It allows you to fade out some things. I mean, you can do this. You can design in PowerPoint. PowerPoint's graphics capabilities are really getting good. But if you want to get serious, there is a free tool, and I'm going to show you that. It's called GIMP, G-I-M-P. And there are also some that are less expensive, so I'm going to show you. I have a few of those listed. Also, you want to try to enhance your images. I'm not sure what this looks like on your screen, but this image on the left looks kind of dark and yellowish. And you can brighten it up and take away the yellow if you have a good graphic program, the yellow tint. So you want a graphic program that can enhance images. And you also want one that can cut out backgrounds so you can place people, you know, on another planet. So Matthew says, wrote GIMP, and that's one of the free ones. There's Photoshop Creative Suite now. They're not selling Photoshop as an individual software tool. You have to buy a monthly payment, so I don't know what I'm going to do about that. Photoshop Elements has a lot of the important functionality. You can get that for around $100. I hope that Adobe is going to continue to sell that. I've heard that it doesn't have kerning, but it has a lot of the other capabilities. There's GIMP. You've got PowerPoint, and people are coming out with alternatives to Photoshop, so do a search for that with programs that are easier to use. Is Photoshop easy to use without taking a course to learn how to use it? No, I don't think it's easy to use. Would anyone out there agree with me? I'm not saying it's impossible, but I think if you go to lynda.com, L-Y-N-D-A, lynda.com, you can take a course. I think it's $25 a month, pay for 1 month, take a course in Photoshop, and I think you'll be a lot happier. The layer paradigm, I've tried to teach it to people. It's just a little bit odd to get used to. It's just like what animators used to use with a light table, but it's still hard for a lot of people to get. Photoshop is a monster. Of course, once you know it, once you learn anything, you think it's easy, right? And you only have to learn the top maybe 10 or 20% of functionality. There's a learning curve to use GIMP as well. I have heard that. I haven't used it. It's worth an investment in your time. Another thing that I want to encourage people to get, and I have an article about this, building your design toolbox, is to get a design tablet, because drawing with a mouse, cutting out backgrounds with a mouse is like working with a bar of soap. Somebody have a question? The Wacom tablets, these Intuos tablets are on the expensive side, a couple $100. You might want to start out with a Bamboo. They sell these at Best Buys, and they might not have all the functionality, but they are, a lot of people say they're wonderful, and they're a lot cheaper. So this might be a good place to start. But when you want to cut something out, cut out a background, just draw a little shape, it's just a lot easier with a tablet. That's probably one of the reasons you get frustrated with your abilities, because you're trying to draw with a mouse. I mean, that's literally impossible. Okay, great. Matthew has the Bamboo and says it's excellent. That's great. Everyone tells me it's excellent. Maybe I'm kind of stupid for bought the Intuos. So they're a couple $100. Also, it's great to have a scanner because you might find some textures that you really like, and you can scan them in and use them, or you might take a photo or of something, and you might want to scan that in. Of course, everybody's got a digital camera, so forget the photo idea. You might have a cool piece of paper, a torn piece of paper that you want to scan in. Then you really need a good-sized monitor. I know everyone has budgets and bosses and so forth and so on, but if you can plug your laptop into a large, decent monitor, it really helps you to become a better designer. I'm wondering if everyone here knows about the graphic formats. These are the 4 most common formats. I'll just run through it quickly. I think maybe people here are experienced in that. Sorry that text isn't black. It was supposed to be converted to white. The good thing about JPEGs is that they have a small file size, and they're good for photographs. That's what they were originally made for. On the left is a higher quality, and on the right is a lower quality. So you can see it makes a difference. You want to go with a higher quality. A PNG file allows you to have a transparent background. It's called an alpha channel. Let's see, do I have a file size there? No. Well, anyway, the same graphic in a PNG is a larger file size than it was in a JPEG. It gives you a higher quality graphic. But again, they're hard to cut out. I used the magic wand tool in Photoshop and ended up with this, and so you still have to smooth it out. There's kind of no easy way with an eraser tool. There are some little tricks. You can do a feathering approach, but in the end you often have to do it very manually, and it takes some time. The reason I was just showing you that is to just say there's no one perfect answer to it, to anything. A GIF file does give you a little bit of a transparent background. It's an older technology, and one of the problems with GIF is that it uses a limited color palette. I think it's 256 colors is the max. So some graphics just don't use good. My recommendation is to forget about GIFs. And PSD files are the Photoshop document, PSD Photoshop document, because you might hear, maybe you're looking for a graphic, and it says a PSD file. I just wanted to make sure everyone knew that that was a Photoshop file. There is a tool out there. You can look for a PSD to JPEG converter that will flatten out the file and turn it into a JPEG. Oh, someone just asked, is there a free tool to take a JPEG and make it a PNG? I'm sure, I'm pretty sure that GIMP will do that. Photoshop definitely does it. I think most of the graphic programs just do file save as, and you can save it in a variety of formats. But the PSD, yes, will keep the layers. So you can go back in and edit it again. To make it a PNG file, though, if you don't want a background, you have to cut it out in some tool. And PowerPoint does that too. It'll say remove background. I don't think it works great, but I think if you play around with it, you might be able to get it. I don't really think we have time to analyze examples. I'd like to just take a few questions here, but I did have some examples, and I wanted to thank everyone. You're very attentive and great questions. What kinds of issues are you coming upon? Any other questions people wanted to ask? What kind of things are you struggling with at work? Feel free to use the audio if that's easier for you.
Nobody has struggles? Oh, goodness.
Oh, here we go.
That's
Beth
wonderful.
says, I'm glad that you have struggles. Okay. Just joking. Struggling with peers who make things too busy. Well, I think one of the best defenses that you have for peers and bosses is to just learn a little bit of the cognitive psychology that's involved. So, for example, you can just tell people that working memory can only handle 4 to 5 bits of information. It's not 7 like they used to think. And therefore, and you can also tell people about the processing fluency. Just look that up. I have an article about it. There are other articles about it. Tell people that when things are busy, it's difficult to process. And people, it defeats learning. It detracts from learning. Lynn says, your first screen on visual language. What was the definition? A system of communication that uses graphical elements. I can't remember. I'll go back there. Sarah says she has the same problem. So what do you think about telling people, using your, I'm going to run through these real quickly, sorry. Hope it's not too distracting. That using the graphic, using cognitive psychology to convince people that working memory can only handle a small number of things. Forget it doing it this way. I'm going to just go back this way. Does anyone think that that could work?
Connie, it's Beth. I do think that's a really good idea, and I think sometimes too what I need to start doing more is just like showing them what good looks like, so maybe like taking a page that they've done that's really busy and just showing them other options of different ways they could lay it out.
Great, yeah. Decluttering it for people. That can work. There's that definition. Yeah, showing examples to contrast it. So Jessica's designing visually on a zero budget. I feel for you, Jessica. So how can you make visuals uniform if I'm pulling from Google searches and free sites? Okay, well certainly you can make the template and the background uniform. Pick out a palette. Sometimes you can, in graphic programs, you can turn everything, I don't know, it might be boring, but turn everything black and white or sepia. I think if you use like similar borders, perhaps making things look like they're photos and using that kind of thick white border. I'm just coming up with ideas off the top of my head. Just somehow making things similar shape, cropping them in the same way, using a consistent palette, consistent typeface, and consistent backgrounds, that might help. Yeah, processing different images through a filter. Okay, that's good. Using similar templates, using a lot of white space. In this, I was just teaching a visual design workshop in New York just last week, and one of the exercises I gave people was to declutter. I gave them a really messy slide, and after I taught them about white space, I said declutter it now, and it was just great. As far as showing people how you can declutter things, and only put up on the screen or in your training manual what people need to look at. Decluttering sounds like fun. Anything else? Any other questions? Feel free to email me. My last name's a little bit hard. It's Connie at ConnieMalamed.com, but if you go to the eLearning Coach site and go to the contact form, that comes directly to me as an email. So feel free to email me. And people had a lot of questions that I couldn't answer today, about all kinds of things. So if someone wanted to talk about blogging, please feel free to email me. I wanted to talk about all kinds of things. Someone asked about my background, and I have a background in art and art education, and then I got a master's in instruction design. But I think that, from courses like this, maybe you can take some visual design courses on lynda.com. I think get some books. I'm pretty sure you can learn it on your own. And just, of course, like anything else, just keep really practicing. So I think that's it, unless anyone has more questions. And Beth, thanks for buying the book. At least I've sold one copy.
More questions for Connie, everyone?
I learned by looking at good examples, Joe says, and so do I. I have a pretty big library of visual design books. That's where I get inspiration and examples. Can you briefly talk about your iPhone app? I actually just got it made into an Android app. I have to change my description, Greg. I didn't realize that was in there.
Oh,
so it's
okay.
for Android too. It's very simple. It's got 473 definitions, and it was very difficult to write all of them. So it's very simple. It's got 7 categories. You can search by using a search term. You can search, scroll down or use the alphabetical index for a term, or go through the categories like legal, media, social media. Maybe it's graphics. I can't remember. It's a year or so old now. And basically it gives you definitions, a few tips, if I thought that there could be an instructional design tip in there for you, and it hyperlinks to related terms. Thank you for the Android version. You're welcome.
Connie, this is
And
Greg.
it cost $4.99. A lot of yeah. Go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry. The lag
I was just
kind
going to
of
say that.
cut you off. I
Right.
apologize.
I was just going to say it does cost, and people are a little bit shocked about that. That an app can actually cost something. But the programmers were expensive, and I had to pay them back. Sorry. Go ahead, Greg.
I was going to ask you, with the idea of mobile getting bigger and bigger, how does that impact? Can you talk about how it might impact the design and graphics if something's going to be viewed, in a mobile device or on a, 4-inch screen compared to, somebody's full computer screen or in a book or a handout, something like that?
Yeah, I mean, talk about reduced realism and going abstract. I think that we're going to, I put no graphics in my app, and it killed me to do that. And I think there are some places where I could use a few simple diagrams, and I'm hoping to eventually get the time to put those in. But I think our visual design for mobile has to be extremely simple. The whole approach to subtractive design, where you remove everything that you don't need, is going to be big. So I think we'll probably end up using more of iconic art, when we need graphics, or very simple diagrams, and just simple, clean, and decluttered. How about you, Greg? I mean, what do you think about it?
Well, I guess, I struggle with, some clients that I work with that will say, well, yeah, can you do a mobile version of that too? And it's like, well, there's two ways we can do it. We can do what you just talked about, the real stripped down version, to say, well, here it is. But then they'll say, well, we want like, a version for the computer and one for the mobile, but we don't have very much money.
Right.
So I mean, one way to approach it is to do two different versions. And one is to say, well, let's just go with the mobile because that might be all you can afford, and then you can hopefully make do with that. So I mean, that's a challenge.
I agree. I mean, I have definitely come upon the same thing, and you can't shrink e-learning and put it on the phone. What I've seen videos, short little video snippets that work well on the phone. I saw one where they were training someone how to do job interviewing, and I thought that worked well on the phone. But basically, it's not e-learning on a phone, and it's really learning snacks or learning chunks, just little. That's why I really think performance support is one of the best uses of mobile. People just look things up, and that's what they use it for, rather than sitting there and taking, full-on lessons. I mean, who can sit there and hold a phone for an hour? Now, if you're talking about an iPad, that's something, or a digital tablet, that you could hold, you could do more of an e-learning course on. But a little phone screen it's annoying. You don't want to have to hold it for too long. Anybody else? Oh, the name of the app, it's called Instructional Design Guru. And I came up with this brilliant name first called Instructional Design Reference. And I thought that was so fascinating because I'm so geeky. And I told it to my daughter, and she just said, she works in publishing, and she just said, that is so boring. Why don't you call it Instructional Design Guru? And I went, oh, yeah, that's so much better. What am I working on now? I'm doing a lot of work for Johns Hopkins and for the International Monetary Fund, just chugging away like every other instructional designer, e-learning, slides. I want to write a book about all of the stuff that I just taught today, so I'm also looking for publishers. I made a proposal, and I think it's time to put all this into a book, which is different than the first book, which had a lot to do with cognitive psychology. This would be more visual design. So thanks for asking. Timeline? Well, I haven't found a publisher yet. I'm still talking to. I just finished the proposal. Oh, thanks, Carolyn.
Any other questions or comments for Connie? Now, Connie, from my perspective, I guess what I see more and more is, 10 years ago, somebody in our field could get away with being an instructional designer and not really being big on using graphics and knowing about graphics and thinking about, the visual part, where now that just seems more important than ever, and it just seems like there's always things to learn as things kind of grow and develop, and as time goes on, it's almost like we can never know enough because things are always changing. So I think your topic is a real important one.
I totally agree. I mean, I think it's a fact because of the web that the whole progression of visuals has just become so powerful. There are so many more visuals being used now. I won't be surprised if some enlightened schools, are starting to teach it little kids. I haven't seen it yet, but it's time to start teaching children how to communicate visually, so that, because when they're adults, I mean, who knows how amazing it's going to be with 3D printers and 3D graphics. It's like we're overwhelmed with visuals now. It's so important. So yeah, in this field, it's just so amazing. We just have to continually learn. It's tiring and it's exciting all at the same time. And like Lynn says, graphics make a powerful statement. I just like to say, I really appreciate everyone here. Just thank you so much. You've all been so nice, and just really thanks for all the thanks. I really appreciate your appreciation. Thank you so much.
Well, I want to take
class,
this.
Greg. I'd like to sit in.
I want to take this opportunity to thank you, because I know you're a busy person, and when someone is running their own business, time is very important. So for you to take time to speak with us this evening is very much appreciated, and I love your books, your ideas, your presentations. I love your blog. I love a lot of things. So thank you so much. We really
thank you so much. I hope everyone goes away from this feeling really confident in their creativity. Take care.
All right. Thank you, Connie.
All right.
All
you
right.
need the screen back, or how are you going to do the
yeah,
screen?